There are so few ingredients in biscuits and so many ways to make them. Here's one super easy recipe for buttermilk biscuits. So the key to tender biscuits is to use the right kind of flour. And for this, that's self-rising flour. That's flour that's had baking powder and salt already added to it, and you can find that in the baking section of your grocery store. Self-rising flour is generally made with a soft winter wheat, which actually gives you a more tender result. So put your self-rising flour into the big bowl and add some sugar to it. That's gonna give it just a tiny bit of sweetness and make it really, really nice and flavorful. Stir that together to evenly distribute everything. And now it's time to cut in the butter. Now when you cut in butter, you can do it with cold butter in your fingers, but here's a little tip for you. Freeze that stick of butter and then we're gonna grate it into the flour. What this does is it creates small chunks of butter into the flour and you don't have to actually use your fingers to cut it in. So be careful at the very end not to grate your fingers and get all of that butter into nice tiny little pieces into the flour. Now I take the butter wrapper while it's still here and has some butter on it, and I'm gonna lightly grease a cake pan. I've lined that cake pan with a piece of silicone liner so I can be sure to get those biscuits out without any trouble. Let's stir that butter into the flour and sugar and make sure that all the little chunks of butter get evenly distributed and coated in the flour. If you see any big chunks, just get in there with your fingers and break them up. So that's really easy, we love that. Now if we're going to have a moist biscuit and we want a moist result, we have to start with a moist beginning. So I'm gonna add buttermilk to this and it's gonna be quite a wet dough. Stir it in, but don't over stir it. When you over stir it, you're gonna be making something that's more like bread. We want something flaky, light, and delicious. That's what we're doing here with these buttermilk biscuits. Okay, now as I mentioned, this is gonna be a wet dough. A lot of people make a stiff dough and cut biscuits out of it, but in this recipe, we're gonna make it rather wet. You shouldn't be able to cut it. That's how wet it should be. So we're gonna use all-purpose flour here because this is gonna coat the outside of the biscuit and we don't want any flavor of baking powder on the outside of the biscuit. I put it onto a cookie sheet and I roll it around like that. I'm gonna take a spoon and I'm gonna scoop even-sized portions of this batter into the flour, but don't let them touch each other. When you have about 6 or so lumps of dough in here, we're gonna roll them around a little bit on that flour and then grab it, toss it in the flour and just toss it back and forth from your hand to the other hand and then pop it right into the cake pan, right up against the side of the wall. Now the next one you put right next to the first one so that they're resting against each other. This is gonna help the biscuit rise up instead of rising out. So once you've finished dusting all your biscuits and shaping them so gently in the flour there, put it in the pan. This is gonna go into a 425-degree oven for 25 minutes. So after 25 minutes in the oven, we're gonna take it out, take a look and see how they're doing, and brush a little butter on top. That butter's gonna give it more browning and a little bit of a sheen. Okay, all brushed, 5 more minutes just to get a little more browning on top and then they're good to go. So in no more than 5 more minutes, you'll have a nice little browning on top of those biscuits. It's time to take them out of the oven and take them out of the pan. This is where that silicone liner really becomes helpful. We'll just lift the biscuits right up out of the pan, just like this, and then we're gonna transfer them to a plate and break them apart. Look at that, so pretty. So call everybody to the table if they're not in the kitchen already, because you know, no one can resist a warm biscuit.